one of the things that we have going on these days is that we aren't quite sure how to handle the end of life. We don't talk about it, and we as a society, I guess, at least in America, have gotten better at figuring out how to keep a body alive than we have at figuring out how to maintain quality of life. And that's one of the things that kind of led me to thinking about doing 36 days. Partly it was just a personal reflection. I started making the drawings as a way to kind of figure out how I was thinking about my dad's passing. Partly also because it seems like we need to address the more complicated and nuanced questions that arise from end-of-life conversations. My family actually had the conversations, but it turns out that you think things are relatively straightforward and easy, and then life is nice and complicated and weird. I started with this image of the phone because so much of my relationship to my parents at the time was over the phone. And this is actually, it's hard to tell, I suppose, in such a minimal drawing, but it is a payphone. Maybe the little extra blob there and the thickness of that wire would indicate, maybe the shape would indicate, but part of the idea was that in this age of cell phones, a payphone still reads as a symbol of telecommunication, but it also feels sort of distanced or broken. And especially in this age of cell phones, there are few circumstances under which you would use a payphone, and it seems like all of them would be bad. So part of the idea was to use that as a kind of indicator that things weren't right. The imagery along here is actually abstractions based on writing out the conversations that I was having with my mom and then folding them over each other on tracing paper and then kind of tracing the letter forms as they turned into these sort of abstractions. And then, as you can see, we're going to have a couple more later on, and the idea is that the text gets more frantic, and so the way in which it's drawn changes too. This one was based on overlays of the different places that we've moved with solid lines indicating the changes in location within the United States, and then the dashed lines are showing changes as we move across the ocean. Driving is love. One of the ideas also is the sort of inability of American men to communicate. Sorry guys, it's true. And the way in which, therefore, our actions sometimes become the way in which we demonstrate love. This is the path that my dad took when he drove from San Angelo to Austin every weekend in the station wagon to be home for the weekend, even though he was stationed 8 hours away from home. This one is based on an alarm clock that I actually did use when I was in college. The problem with an old school alarm clock like this, though, is that there is no snooze button. So then you have to actually get up. That's no good. Fortunately, we've solved that problem with phones. This is one of two drawings that is still has a little bit of graphite in there. I would lightly draw in the forms with graphite, and when I was adding in the EKG lines from Dad's readout, I felt like I didn't want to cross the face of the clock, and so I just left those in graphite and then went back to ink when I got to the other side. Also, it's set on the day that Dad had the false alarm, so 11/23/24. I have to look it up. That's sort of sad. Oh, we have to talk about this one because that is Bear Jr. Bear Jr. is my daughter's teddy bear from when she was a wee little child. It is Bear Jr. because my wife's teddy bear was named Bear. We're a very creative family. And I was also trying to set this up sort of as an equation. So like the phone call, getting ready, packing up the family, and then driving. The story of taking my mom to Thanksgiving dinner and driving and paying and therefore being an adult now turned out to be a little more true than I realized. Part of why it was significant to me is that like she didn't even think about the idea that she was going to pay as the parent, because the man always pays. That's what we're for. And so when she and I went alone to Thanksgiving dinner because Dad was in the hospital with that first big health scare, pattern was established that like it was my job now to take care of things. Dad's recliner. These are TV listings. I'm not sure if anybody's ever been able to recognize that. The idea was to sort of make a play on a wooden floor and yet still take like the cable segment. So we'd have like a half-hour program versus an hour-long program versus a longer program. I cheated on this and did not use Dad's actual pills. These are medicines that were in his medicine cabinet after he died. So some of this was cleaning out as opposed to the ones he was actively taking prior to going into the hospital. And then transfusion bag. So yeah, we're starting to see the phone get a little more agitated and kind of break out, occupying more of the space. And then all heck breaks loose. So the surgery that Dad had after his stroke was what's called burr hole surgery. And these are the drawings based on the patents of the instruments that you use. Essentially, there's a stabilizer here to make sure that you're going through the skull, and then they have specially adapted drill bits, essentially, to drill a little hole. What they were trying to do was relieve the pressure that was building up from the excess blood, and then trying to create a series of sort of network paths that show how these pieces related to each other, and then also relate to where in Dad's brain he was having the surgery, while also kind of showing that massive confusion that all those intersecting lines will result in. Mom's punch bowl. So this is actually what she always calls Sissy's punch bowl, which is her mother, so my grandmother's punch bowl. This is actually something that is part of family discussion right now, because when Mom moved into the memory care unit at her senior living facility, one of the conversations was if she should not have important, fragile, breakable, valuable things. And I have no idea as to the actual value of my grandmother, now mother's, punch bowl. It's a frilly china porcelain pink and white thing with gold trim, and then it's got this little pedestal that's got a mirrored base so that you can see blah, 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 blah. One of the conversations that we were having with the memory care folks was like, should somebody who is in cognitive decline not have this? And I pointed that out because she might break it. And I pointed out that she loves this punch bowl more than she loves me. So it was going to be important that it be in her room. Trying to sort of think about what Dad was going through, and also the waiting game that we were playing. This is drawing the hands of the clock that was the grandmother's clock that my parents have in their house, along with brainwave patterns where we're trying to figure out whether or not Dad is, he was sedated, but whether or not his brain was functioning as it should have been. And then platoon, because my mom did not have a great relationship with the doctors. They would come in, they would go out really fast. She always wanted them to slow down, always wanted a little bit more time. She also had to go through a sort of grieving process every time they would tell her anything. And they didn't really have an accommodation for that kind of thing. They would tell her something and she would need time to think through what it meant before she could ask any questions, and they were already out the door, so there was lots of coming back afterward. As is manifested in the arguments, conversations, discussion, debate, not sure what the right word is there, as to whether or not Dad should be given a tracheotomy. He was obese, and it was therefore very difficult for the doctors initially to intubate him. And even when it was time to take the breathing tube out, they didn't trust that he would be able to breathe on his own, and they didn't want to have to try to intubate him again because they were already concerned that he had lost oxygen to the brain during the surgery process. So they wanted to put in a tracheotomy. Ultimately, it wasn't really that traumatic or difficult of a decision. It's just that, again, the communication between Mom and the doctors was such that when they said, okay, we're going to do this, she basically said, what? And wanted to fight it because she didn't know what was going on and didn't like the idea of them cutting another hole in Dad. This is one of my artistic quotations. It's actually the scales from a Dürer etching of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and death carries those scales as an indicator of the judgment to come. And here I'm sort of thinking about the judgment to come and what's going on. And this is a series of graphs that indicate the fatality rates for leukemia patients based on a certain age and how quickly they're intervened. The leukemia treatments start the interventions. So here the generation of judgments is sort of thinking about how we're all going to have to figure out what we want to do with things. That was Dad's actual hospital recliner on these giant casters for this relatively tiny little space for my huge dad to fit into. These lines that sometimes show up, I try to have at least one image and then one sort of linear element in each of the drawings, and these are based on drawings of the architecture of the nurses' station just outside Dad's room. You can sort of make out here like the chair, like a rolling office chair silhouette, and then the computer that they work on, and then the wall on like that. Part of the idea here was that the abstractions would have meaning, but they would also kind of operate as a bracket. So this line is going to complement the line that is on Mom's punch bowl that I just passed, because I think of them as kind of a unit, and so like having the parenthetical almost of my parents together, bracketed by this line, but also separated because the lines no longer are matching up. It's getting into the weeds of overthinking things, but there you go. That's what we artists do. The grass. What I was referring to here is a specific anecdote where Dad would just get annoyed at how I would not do a good job of mowing the lawn when I was a teenager in the Texas heat, partly because I was a teenager and partly because of the Texas heat. But also, it came to mind because he would get really frustrated with the nurses who didn't do whatever he wanted when they were trying to start therapies, and especially occupational therapy, and see if he could move and things like that. He was also going in and out of either being sedated or being so sleepy that he might as well have been sedated. But this was when we were still trying to figure out how healthy Dad was going to be and whether or not he was going to recover from the stroke. Here's helping Mom with all of the pots and pans. Dad actually became like quite the cook towards the end of his life, and this manifested itself in him buying everything that Williams or Sonoma had ever made. Most of which was these big, huge, heavy pots that my mom couldn't handle, like physically couldn't handle, and so there was some rearranging that had to be done to accommodate Mom. It was tricky to figure out, are we at the end? Partly because Dad was so unresponsive, and yet at the same time you sort of feel like you should be hoping for your dad to recover. And in my mom's case, she was adamant that she wanted to follow his wishes and that he didn't want to be someone who was artificially kept alive. At the same time, whenever there was an intervention, her first reaction would be to go ahead and want to keep Dad alive, and then to second guess herself constantly and not know what was happening. Partly because Dad was so uncommunicative after the stroke that we didn't really know if we were prolonging the inevitable or setting him up for recovery or what to do. So these questions are always kind of difficult. So Mom's solution whenever faced with a difficult question was research. So she would just read and reread and draw lines and brackets and check marks and stars around all of the information that she could get. The Medicare and You book from that year. And then this was the journal that she was keeping where she was trying to write down her thoughts and her reactions and her frustrations with the doctors and other things. Here's the family conference, my station wagon, my mom's station wagon, and my brother flying in so that we could have the conversation about what we're doing. And then when we went to try to talk to Dad, he had recovered enough that he could talk, but he was indicating the sort of cognitive decline that was ultimately going to get worse and worse over the next couple of days, because when he discovered that he was restrained in the hospital bed so that he wouldn't pull out his IV and things, he kept saying that it was because he was trapped in a seatbelt and that he couldn't get out of the parking lot, and that my mom and my wife, Jennifer, and my brother's wife, Kate, had already gone into the store, but he was stuck here in the parking lot. It's really kind of amazing the way in which the brain works, even when it's not working. It was clear that Dad was trying to rejoin the family, but couldn't rejoin the family. And for whatever reason, hospital bed turned into car, and restraints turned into seatbelt. So that was the parking lot and his seatbelt. This was also derived from patent drawings so that I could get a kind of schematic of the different parts that go into a seatbelt. The representation of Dad's stories. Tomato plants became kind of a shorthand symbol for Dad's growing up with my grandfather. Papa was originally a farmer before moving to the big city of Richmond, Virginia, but always kept a garden, and Dad sporadically would try to create one, although we moved so much due to his being in the Army that it didn't always happen. These are the restraints. They used the sort of cotton ticking tape to tie Dad's hands to the rails of his bed. And then he used to tell a story. One of his own favorite stories was about going rabbit hunting with his dad, and the way in which my father, apparently what happens when you're rabbit hunting is that you have a dog flush out the rabbit, and rabbits, when they're trying to escape both you and the dog, run in a huge circle The idea being that they don't want to go too far from their warren, but they want to lead you away initially before circling back and trying to find a place to hide. And what you as the hunter are supposed to do is apparently to shoot the little bunny, which just seems mean to me. But, Dad was bonding with his dad. To shoot the little bunny when the dog flushes it and runs it and chases it past you. But there was a story that Dad had at the first time he went where he kept missing, and the dog chased the rabbit so that the rabbit circled around 3 times, and Dad missed every time, until finally the dog just sort of sat down and stared at my dad in abject disappointment. So, bunny rabbit. Also, a quote from a Dürer print, in this case one with rabbits. The kind of Jeep that Dad would have been responsible for, because as he was sliding further into the decline that ultimately would claim him, he kept feeling like there was something he should be doing. And one time he was telling the story of trying to, actually it wasn't a story to him, in his head he needed urgently to get a Jeep so that he could deliver water to some of his soldiers. This is a representation of a hospital bed as filtered through the compositional structure of Rauschenberg's bed. So another art historical quote there, thinking about Dad's empty bed. And we're continuing with the art history quotes. So here we've got a wing and a hourglass and another balance that are all derived from the various works by Albrecht Dürer again. I was thinking about Dürer a lot, in part because when we as a family were living in Germany, we actually went to Nuremberg and we toured all over Germany, including Albrecht Dürer's studio and home. And so he's always been kind of important to our family, and therefore is kind of an interesting symbol of art, but also family history. And then there's something about the precision, but also archaic manner in which Dürer is going to create an image that seemed appropriate to sort of thinking about the weight of history and these sort of huge decisions. The clock, the hourglass, is a symbol of life's slipping away from us. An angel's wing, the balance of these weighty issues. And again here, similar to the one before, these are, instead of leukemia success rates, these are graphs showing the typical success rates of strokes. Crossword puzzle and comfort care. So comfort as symbolized by the sock, but also this is me being really petty, because one of the things that, so I was grumpy at Dad a lot after he died, especially because it seemed like the cause of death was so much of his own not taking care of himself. And so the way in which he was mean inadvertently to someone that I loved, part of the frustration also was just like the decisions that your parents make that are not the decisions that you would make. For example, despite the fact that we grew up not in an impoverished home, but the Army doesn't pay especially well, and so things were fairly lean growing up in a way that builds character, as we all know. And then it was interesting to see Dad, once he retired, be sort of extravagant, as in this case represented by the fact that when I was clearing out Dad's things, he had 187 pairs of socks, which is a ridiculous number, and kind of offensive that, you would allocate your limited financial resources so poorly. And even if your financial resources aren't that limited, spending that kind of money when you could have paid off the student loans of your children or grandchildren, or fed the hungry, or done something useful that would have gotten you out of the house and kept you healthy and moving. Any of those things seem like better choices than accumulating 187 pairs of socks. And I hasten to clarify also that this wasn't because he never threw away ratty old socks. They were all pristine, brand new. One of my mom's cousins, who lives in Wyoming, came down to Colorado to help with the cleaning out and moving when Mom was moving out of the house that she and Dad shared at the end. And her line was that she'd never seen such neatly organized hoarders, but there was just so much stuff. I cut that from the book because it just seemed really, really petty, but yeah, Dad had a lot of socks. All gold-toed too, because, quality matters. This is actually not my father's watch, it is my grandfather's watch, but therefore a kind of good symbol for fatherly devotion and family heirlooms, and the watch became my father's and then became mine because of the passing of generations. These are also my grandfather's tools that my father inherited and now I've inherited, and I've actually, because I had already bought my own tools, packed them away for my son to inherit. And so we'll keep going on through the generations. I was initially going to split them between my son and my daughter, but my daughter seemed to think that she did not need a bunch of tools that were really old, and like the ball peen hammer, the head actually is about to come off if you were to swing it hard because the wood is so old that it no longer has a tight seal. So we'll see if when he's older my son is interested in the idea of a tool as an heirloom. They were for me such a kind of potent symbol of like what a man does around the house. He helps, he works, he does those kinds of things. Heaven forbid he talk or play games or hug his children or anything like that. But when the kitchen sink is dripping, we got a tool for that. And then the Stillness at the end for Dad. This was intended to reference the IV drops that had been happening earlier in the book, where the water dripping down as a sort of symbol for both time but also life slipping away. In that sense, kind of using a water version of an hourglass. And then this is the last ripple stilling. And then these are 3 of the shell casings from Dad's funeral. He was given a military burial, and they fired the rifles as part of the salute. And then, I hadn't seen this before, but at least at Fort Logan, they put the casing in the flag that had been in the coffin when they folded up the flag and presented it to my mom. And then this is a photo or a drawing based on a photograph at Fort Logan of the graves, and erasing all but one to reference the one person that I know who is there. The mountains in the background, the flag at permanent half-staff because it's a military cemetery, and then this tree, because I took the photograph in winter, and so it doesn't have the life of the evergreens, but balances out the sort of precarious fragility of the flagpole.